All right, well, it looks like that time to me. It's 11:15, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. If you have not yet introduced yourself and would like to do that in the chat, please feel free. We are delighted to be here today, and I would love to introduce who will be talking today. So I'm Christine Noack. I'm the chair of English at HACC, which is an acronym for Harrisburg Area Community College. We have 5 campuses across central Pennsylvania and a robust suite of virtual offerings serving students internationally. With me today is Kim Hall, Professor of English, Hedel Thacker, Associate Professor of English, and Karen Woodring, also Professor of English. We're going to chat a bit today about our lessons learned in alternative assessment. So many of you may have been reading or employing or considering the use of alternative assessment in your classrooms. And so we have been doing that as well. And we are here to talk a little bit about the things that we have learned in our experimentation and to hear from you as well. If you would love to share anything about your own experiences, we would welcome the opportunity to talk about that. So what do we mean when we talk? I'm sorry? Did someone want to jump in? All right, well, if you are not on mute, if you could mute yourself, that would be fabulous. Our alternative assessment framework. So when we talk about alternative assessment, we are talking about a suite of assessment options that deviate from the what we would call the traditional assessment options. And so those are things like authentic assessment, contract grading, labor-based grading, specifications grading, and ungrading. And we're not going to talk through the details of these frameworks at the moment. There's lots of materials available as people are expanding their vocabulary around alternative assessment, but the thing that binds these together is the idea of increasing student agency and student ownership in the classroom, empowering students in their learning, and avoiding some of the traps of traditional assessment practices, which we know from lots and lots of empiricism don't actually increase student learning or motivation. There are some misconceptions about traditional grading practices that students won't work, for example, if there aren't grades attached to the work that they submit. And as an ungrader myself, I can assure you that that is certainly not the case in my experience. My part of the presentation is to provide that framework for you and also to provide this framework, which is very simply, there are some caveats involved in doing this work. Positionality does matter, and what I mean by positionality is the social location from which we do our work and the power structures that impede on us or facilitate our ability to make decisions in the classroom. People are in different positions in their organizations and different positionalities. So one of the things I share with faculty who are interested in doing alternative assessment is that there are risks that come with this work, and it's important for us to critically examine our positionality in an organization before we dive headlong into disrupting traditional grading frameworks, because there will be competing pressures and dynamics that will potentially put us at risk. So positionality always matters. In my own study of 13 faculty members who are employing alternative assessment internationally, that was one thing that came up repeatedly when I ask about facilitating and constraining factors. A facilitating factor for faculty is their positionality. They were white, or they were male, or they were tenured. There is some facilitating factor that provides less risk in their experimentation in the classroom. Context also matters. These grading paradigms, alternative assessment frameworks, do not deploy perfectly across disciplines. We need some variation from one discipline to the next, and we need to be attentive to whatever context in which we're working. That is disciplinary context, that is institutional context, that is organizational context. And I recommend that people take a look at this article I have linked here from Pittman and Tobin, which outlines some of those things. One of the things we know from student feedback, for example, is that it is infused with biases, especially around women faculty who are teaching in areas that are not traditionally role associated, and especially when people are not enacting gender expectations in their teaching. So these are all caveats that frame the work that we do in alternative assessment practices, and it bears mentioning because we are not here to suggest that all faculty can deploy these mechanisms equally, evenly, and without risk. So I want to be clear that there is time and space for faculty to be thinking about their unique context before they go down the pathway of employing alternative assessment. So with that, that is my 5 minutes, and I would love to turn it over to my colleague, Kim Hall, who's going to talk specifically about a context for using her non-traditional grading practices in the mini-master context. So Kim, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you. So I'm Kim Hall. I've been teaching for 20 years, which means that I am tenured. So when I became tenured, when I earned tenure, that's when I got brave with my grading. And I decided that I wanted to move away from traditional grading for a very long time because I found my students were just chasing points and not actual learning or improvement. And so then finally I earned tenure and I got brave and I did that. So in 2015, I began with standards-based grading, and I did that in a developmental education course. I went back to my old K through second grade report cards of outstanding, satisfactory, unsatisfactory. Like that was what I went with, and it went really, really well. Students reported that they liked not having the pressure in that, short 6-week class of worrying about points and, oh my goodness, they didn't do well and they lost points. And so it was just a really good experience. When I translated or tried to translate that to college level, they liked the idea, but they quickly regressed and they went back to, they turned outstanding, satisfactory, unsatisfactory into 90, 70, 50. And so they defeated my entire purpose. So with college level composition, what I do is ungrading. So everything is pass-fail. They have a chance to revise. At the end, we compare their work together against the grading metrics that we had from for the whole term, and that's how we proceed. I use contract grading in literature courses. I'm not as experienced with that one, but no matter what I do, self-reflection and self-assessment is a very large part of it. So next one, Christine. There we go. Oh, okay.
Sorry.
No, that's all right. That's fine. So biggest challenges for me compared with a full-term class. So I think anyone who has adapted a 14-week class, or well, for us, full-term is 14. Anytime you try to adapt a full-term to say summer or mini-mester, which for me is 7 weeks, you recognize that how the time you have is limited and how you use it is very important. And so when I have the additional challenge of introducing a new assessment type to them, that means now I'm really under the gun, right? Because now I have limited time to familiarize them with the grading system and how it works, to talk about grades with them, to talk about academic writing, and then to also model and practice self-assessment, because that's a skill that they don't typically come to me with. That means that I have a tight schedule for providing feedback because I teach composition and my classes can have up to 23 students in them. That means revisions keep coming in, and so that can lead to burnout. How you use your time is always important, but I find it's incredibly important in a 7-week or some shorter session class like that. So my lessons learned are about how to do the pacing, and that's our next slide. So in spring of 2020, and this worked out so well because in the spring, in January of 2020, I moved to this schedule. and it saw me through the quick pivot to pandemic teaching and remote teaching. It has seen me through 2 years in Zoom and D2L exclusively. So I feel like this one is tried and true. If it can see you through a pandemic, it's going to work. So what I do is I do a lot of work on the front end. So T minus 2 weeks, I send them everything I have about the course, the schedule, the syllabus. I explain the assessment method, and I walk them through it. And then when we come in weeks 1 and 2, this is what we do. And when you look at it, it kind of looks crazy. And at first I thought this was too much time to spend on the grading system and, grades and writing and those discussions. But, I thought I need to get to the content because I only have 7 weeks and I have to skate through this really quickly and get to the content. And what I learned was that is the worst mistake I've made. Putting together, just taking 2 weeks out of my total of 7 has really saved me trouble. So I use weeks 1 and 2 to have those discussions about grades. What do they mean? What do they measure? What do they not measure? What are your experiences? We talk about academic writing, what they know, what they think they need to know, which is always enlightening. We talk and we practice self-assessments. And then weeks 3, 4, 5, 6, we do essays 1, 2, 3, and 4, which again seems crazy, but because I take the time to really lay the foundation, it goes very smoothly. And then in week 7, we do final portfolios and we do grade conferences. And so I will say, even though this looks sort of skewed and out of whack, it has worked very, very well. They understand the system. They're part of the grading system from the very beginning because they do self-assessments and they do progress check-ins and we conference. When we get to the actual essays, I've noticed the number of people who have to revise, say, a second time, a third time. I don't have those anymore. Where before pandemic, before this schedule, I had people on their third revisions sometimes, and it was becoming too much. With the grading conferences, we almost always agree what the grade should be. There's very little debate or conversation because we've been having the conversation through the whole term, whatever length the term is. And so really importantly, my grade challenges have dropped to almost 0, which in the English department is that's pretty remarkable. So I consider it a great success. Students report that they like this system. And so I took a few of my feedback comments from this academic year. The one that I love is the first one that says made them want to do better. I also I simply couldn't coast by, and it was intellectually challenging because, it's 7 weeks. There's a lot of pressure that you can put on students and yourself unnecessarily in 7 weeks, especially if you're changing the grading system from the standard 100-point scale. But students, once I lay it out for them, I spell it out, we talk about it, they buy in, and we do really great work. So those are my very quick lessons learned from using alternative assessment in mini-mesters. And next will be Hetal Thacker, and she's going to tell you her lessons learned from honors classes. Hetal?
Thanks, Kim. So I tried ungrading somewhat similarly to what Kim explained. So that was a great setup for me, although I'm never ready 2 weeks before the semester begins, so I could never send anything out 2 weeks early. So for me, I think that when I think about alternative assessment, I think about what I want to accomplish, what I want my students to accomplish in my class, and how can rethinking assessment help me better help them achieve that, right? So when I think about what's important in a composition class, any composition class, although I did try this with honors Comp 1, is that I want my students to take risks in their writing. So I want them to be thinking about, how have I done things before? What are some habits that I acquired that maybe I need to shrug now, right, in this new stage of my writing, and being willing to fail, right? You try something new and there's a good chance it's not going to work out, and that needs to be okay. So that's definitely something that I was hoping that this would help along. And also I wanted students to be a little bit more empowered in the classroom. So I'm always thinking about the power structure of a classroom and ways that I can give my students a little bit more agency, and writing can be such a fraught topic for a lot of students. And so this is a way for me to hopefully encourage a little bit more, personal self-assessment, personal, reflection, and also help them feel a little confident that, hey, if my professor thinks that I can, assess my own learning, then that's probably a good thing. Slide, please. So, like Kim was mentioning, there is a lot of kind of front-end discussion about grading. I too spend, the first week and a half talking about grading. There is a huge grading philosophy. So where I think typically in a typical class with a traditional grading structure, it might be more, numbers, like 40% of your grade is X and 50% is Y. This is more philosophy, right? Like what am I hoping that your grades will do? Why am I doing this? Like what was so wrong with the traditional grading structure? And luckily for me, it ties in really well with our first unit as well, which is also about education. But it is a lot of discussion about this. And I think the next slide also is kind of what I outline as the way that their grades are developed. But after those first discussions, I make sure, a week later, hey, has anybody been thinking about the grading structure? Anybody have any questions? It's good to kind of go back to it throughout the semester. And what I have found was, yes, they did. And one person's question leads to another person's question. And, I am so aware of the anxiety levels of our students that I really want to be, trying to alleviate that as much as possible. So if this is something new to them, and in this particular class it was new to everybody, then I want to give them lots of opportunities to talk it out. And to me, that is valuable. And hearing them talk on Zoom is valuable, right? As we all know, when we have a silent class. So that's all really important to me. So they always want to know, well, how am I going to figure out what my grade is? Because ultimately my students chose their own grades based on the work that they've done. And that is through detailed written feedback from me. They write these personal process and reflection statements with each of their essays, where they do a lot of that metacognitive work of like, here's what I did, here's what I learned, here's how it went, here's what I should have done differently. And then those lead to midterm and final progress reflections. And all of these pieces have really detailed explanations. And I talk about, here's what I would consider A work, and here is, the level of effort and the quality of the final product. And if they need to revise a particular essay, that is something that I talk to them like, oh, this is really kind of off the mark and I think you should try again, rather than saying, 50% meet with me after class to discuss revising this. It's more like, we didn't quite get what we were trying to get. Let's try this again. And then, ultimately I have them write in their progress reflections what grade best reflects the work that they've done, and we talk about that. And then I assign the grade that we talk about. Next slide. So in terms of the feedback, one of the things that I really liked was that a couple students mentioned risk-taking and being more open to criticism, which were two of my main goals of this. And so they really seem to tap into that, hey, I can try new things and, it's not going to affect my grade. They're very grade focused. We have a lot of health career students who are trying to get into clinicals, so they're constantly concerned about their grades. It's just ever present. And a couple people talked about less stress, so I really like that. Next slide. And then in terms of end of term feedback, one thing, and this kind of goes back to what Christine said at the beginning about our misconceptions about grading, those aren't just for faculty, students have them too. My students were so concerned that someone was gonna take advantage of this, right? Like they were very concerned that they were going to take advantage of me and take advantage of this, and you could skate by and not do anything. And actually, it'd be really hard to do that, right? It would take a lot more work, I think, to skate by in a situation like this, than to just do the work. But that was something, it was a different kind of anxiety that they had, right? Like it was unfair or something if somebody else was going to take advantage of it. And so we had to have some conversations like, well, it's actually, not really that big of a deal, and it's not possible. And so what, like you're still, doing your thing, and the whole point of this is to grow. So we had to have some discussions about where that anxiety was coming from, and, about how it was maybe misdirected. And then the last point, I don't know if it's too hard for you to read. Oh, I'm sorry. You could just go back, Christine, for a second. A student mentioned the structure, and I do think that that is something that I'm thinking about, and I'm probably making changes the next time that I do this, which is that I think this worked really well in an honors English comp class where students are pretty comfortable in an academic writing setting, right? These are, if you're confident enough to sign up for honors, you have that comfortability in academic writing. And I also teach a lot of developmental writing. And I think for those students, it might seem a little lacking in structure. And so I have to, we have to think about what's best for our student populations. And Kim kind of outlined how she does things differently for different groups. And we have been talking at HACC about contract grading, and I might be looking at something more along those lines where they have some structure, some sense of what they need to do to like a clear connection between grade and work completed and that sort of thing. So I chose to start with an honors class because it's this much smaller class than our regular comm classes. And for me, that was where I felt most comfortable. It was one section. And I didn't want to overwhelm myself by throwing all of my classes into this the first semester. So next slide. So, I mean, that kind of also goes to this, lessons learned. Yes, this did do a lot of those, encouraging risk-taking and focusing on self-reflection and self-assessment, which I think is just as an educational practice so important and something that I hope that they would continue doing in all of their classes. But it didn't completely alleviate grade anxiety. I think that might be impossible. I'm not sure, but at least for some of our students, I think it lessened it for a lot of students, but I'm not going to delude myself that it was completely gone. And it did make me have to rethink how I structured my class. So it wasn't just grading. It ended up kind of making me restructure the entire class, which was totally worth it. It was totally worth it. So if you're concerned about that, I say, go for it. Okay. I'm going to turn it over to Karen Woodring, who's going to talk about her experiences.
Thanks, Hetal. So unlike Hetal, I'm one of those people who, if I'm going to try something, I'm going to just go all in. So last spring, 2021, I changed, between Christmas and New Year's, I changed all my courses to ungrading. And it was a big switch. But I didn't go completely ungraded. I wasn't ready for that. And part of it was the students were going to struggle with, well, how do I go from being ungraded all semester, even if I have a self-assessment, and even if we talk through it, they wanted to have some sort of number. So 70% approximately of my classes, so it's like if I teach a 14-week class, it's like the first 10 to 11 weeks is all ungraded. They get basically pass-fail, all their discussions, all their pre-writing, all of their essays, and then it depends based on what else is going on. All of my classes have at least 2 graded assignments with a rubric, and you can see the points there because it does change drastically when I'm at the 200 level. And they all do a self-assessment. Every essay that they write, they do a self-reflection on how they got to that point on the essay, what they tried, what was new, how they used previous feedback, that type of thing. But then they do a course self-assessment when they talk about how they've met the course objectives. And that is primarily how their final grade is determined. If they've met the course objectives, they certainly have the potential to get an A. But those other graded assignments help them see, are they on track to get the grade that they think they are. So some students suffer from, very over assessing what they believe, oh, I am a student who's going to get all 100s. I know everything. I didn't even need to take this class. Most of my students, however, greatly underestimate their abilities and what they how they're going to do in a class. So one of the reasons that I changed to ungrading was to focus on the learning, to help them, regardless of where they are on that scale, both their perceptions and their reality of how well they're prepared for this class, and really get everyone to grow. Christine, do you want to switch to the next slide? So I have a number of reasons I switched, and then I'm also giving you my feedback on whether it actually achieved my reasons or not. So for example, students who did poorly on initial assignments struggled to pass, whether it was mathematically or because that first or second assignment, which sometimes was a very low stakes, low point assignment, might just cause them to check out. Oh, I'm bad at writing. I knew I couldn't do this, and it confirms their preconceived notions. Getting away from that, students who would have traditionally gotten poor grades are now redoing those initial assignments. They're learning how to meet criteria. They're learning how to improve their writing. They're getting marked feedback throughout that allows them to see, again, writing is a process. It's a skill. And coincidentally, I used to have students who would skip those pre-writing assignments because they were so few points and they were low stakes, and would then do poorly on the actual essay. Now that everything is essentially 1 point, some students struggle because, well, why is an essay 1 point when I had 5 pre-writing assignments that were also 1 point? They don't like that it's weighted equally. But again, I explain it's ungrading. It's not weighting. So that those pre-writing assignments aren't worth much. They aren't worth more. They're not worth as much as. It's just, did you do it, and did you do it well enough? The second thing that caused me to change, go back, Christine. Students who weren't confident writers were easily forcing themselves into paralysis. So they would earn so many zeros or so many Fs that they would then disengage. So now the students who are less confident thrived because they kept getting feedback that would enforce that they were learning and that they could continue to learn. They could resubmit. So that really helped them a lot in their process. Go ahead, Christine. Grading them while they were learning always seemed to penalize them if they didn't learn as quickly as they should or on my timeline. So while I thought this was going to be addressed with ungrading, what I discovered was a poor grade may not have affected their final grade. And in the ungrading, some students said that they would have preferred a poor grade on one assignment or on part of one assignment rather than having to resubmit it or redo it altogether. They talked about not having time or having to reassess where they spent their time. Two other things that did make the changes that I wanted. Students submitted uninteresting scripted essays with basically a template in mind previously. Now they're much more interesting. They're much more diverse. Like HETAL and Kim said, they are taking many more risks. I had a student submit an assignment about how to do laundry as a form of self-care, and not something that would have been traditionally submitted. Students who were well prepared for writing courses traditionally often didn't improve much in the course of, for example, English 101. Now, some of those already well prepared students are taking more risks, taking more growth, and they're really seeking out how to improve their writing. Whereas before they knew, if I do this, I can get an A. Now they're saying, well, I don't have an incentive to get an A, so what can I do to really push myself? Go ahead. So things I've learned specifically. My first attempt, I did 2-1-0. 2 was it met the expectations. 1 was that it was late, or it was meeting the expectations marginally. My concern was that everyone who got credit might think that means 100, kind of like what HETAL was saying, where they took or maybe it was Kim who was saying they took the O, the S, and the N and kind of made them grade equivalent. So I thought this might be helpful. The students thought a 1 out of 2 meant they got a 50. No, you met it, but I just wanted you to know there's a lot of room for growth. So that really didn't go over well. Now I'm doing the 1-0 just for pass fail. I still have students who misunderstand it. Like I talked about, they're looking at, well, I've gotten 7 1s and 3 zeros, so therefore I must have a 70%. It's not the way it works. I've moved from explaining the grading system in text, like in words, to I give them a video. I walk them through what this might look like for them. It's definitely helped, but they're still struggling initially. Like both of my colleagues have said, I spend more than a week just talking about grading, and I do send them all the information up front ahead of time. I am one of those people who sends out emails 2 weeks before and 1 week before. And then finally, something I love, it's a writing course. So while I always have at least one case of plagiarism, this semester I only had 2. And they were both students I had been working with all semester. They both knew that they weren't doing what they were supposed to be doing, but with the time crunch, that's just the way they went. In the past, I've had up to 7 to 10 cases in a semester, so it's a big move away from that. So for this upcoming fall, I've decided that in addition to all the things that we're already doing, where the students have self-reflection for each essay, they do meet with me mid-semester and they do their self-assessment at the end, that I wanted to have a contract for them at the beginning, really explaining this is what you need to pass. So yes, you need to have these ones. Yes, you need to do the self-assessment, and it needs to explain how you've met the course objectives, and that you have these graded assignments that, again, if you fail your research position paper, how are you going to prove to me that you've met the course objectives? So just to really walk through it with that and have them sign it, do a conference maybe right at the beginning. I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do there. At midterm, when they do the check-in, I'm going to have them do what they think their grade is at that point, and that's what I'll post for midterm grades. Instead of looking at their work and saying, well, representationally, I think this is representative of A work, B work. My midterm grades are traditionally mostly A's. They're all doing what they need to do. However, I have the ones who are already struggling, and because they have so many zeros, their midterm grade ends up being an F versus a B or a C or a D. And I struggle with that because I don't want them to have that grade. So I think by having that midterm conference where they're self-assessing themselves and giving them their midterm grade, I think that will help them a lot. And then in a 6 or 7 week, what Kim was talking about, it's hard for them if they have to redo an assignment to fall behind. So I'm thinking maybe they might have to do like 80% of the assignments as well as the self-assessment or something like that. I haven't quite worked out what I'll do. I'm teaching a 6-week 102 right now. That's English Comp 2, and I want to see how that goes this summer. Okay, next slide. So a lot of my students really liked it. I still have a couple of students who didn't. So if you look at the 4th bullet point, I didn't like the grading policy. I felt traditionally grading would be better for students. Some of the students don't know how to value learning. They've been taught to go for grades and that grades indicate learning. And I'm still struggling with how to help them separate that, because while I can learn a lot, I can still achieve a poor grade. And I don't know how to tell them that other than to tell them about my experiences. And finally, this is where some students were talking about time management, where this person has a personally assigned schedule with work and home, and having to redo an assignment would throw that off balance. And I totally get that. So students don't go into an assignment preparing to have to redo it. Because they know how it works. They're doing these pre-writing assignments, they're doing the check-ins. When they submit an assignment, they anticipate that it will meet the course objectives. So how do I allow for that? And that's one of the things that I'm going to be working on in the future. Like I said, I did start this in spring of 2021. So I did it spring, summer, fall, and spring, again, making different adaptations. I don't know that I'm ever going to get to a point where it will be, this is the way all my courses are, and I'm never changing again. I think it's constantly evaluating and changing. Go ahead. So, What does the audience have to say or ask?
And if you don't have any questions, I am happy to share just a couple of things. One of the things that I've found especially useful is engaging students in 2 exercises at the beginning of the course. One is a syllabus annotation, whereby they actively engage with the syllabus, including my grading memo. And then 2, have them engage in a reading around traditional grading so that they understand more of the philosophy and some of the research around grading, which I have found has been tremendously helpful in orienting them to how they have been trained for traditional grading throughout their educational experiences, and why they may be feeling uncomfortable with this kind of grading structure, and that has helped a whole lot in helping students understand the philosophies.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Do you have any dual enrolled students that are still high school? Because that I'm required to have a letter grade for them at the midterm point, and the high school wants it to be reflective of what they would actually earn if it was the end of the course. And how do you deal with that if you have that?
Yep, we do. And I think Karen described her approach, and we do provide midterm grades and we provide final letter grades. So that's one of the caveats of the whole thing, right, is that we never actually get away from traditional grading because we operate within this system. And so this is what we have to do. We probably all handle that a little bit differently. And Karen, I loved your approach to midterm grades. Did you want to jump in with some additional information?
I was just going to say, my English 101 and 102 are usually at least half dual enrolled students. I teach online, so it's very easy for them to pop into those courses. The other thing is college-wide, our largest major is actually dual enrolled students. So they have the highest percentage of our student body. So they are absolutely in there. I try to talk to the students across the board. I mean, obviously my high school students are very concerned because this is their first college class and this is counting toward college and high school. I have had actually two, dual enrolled students who failed at the end of the semester and then had to redo it. And it does mess them up. I did set them up to succeed. I conferenced with them. I tried everything I could, but they just weren't producing the work.
With that midterm grade, you were talking about at one point with, their progress of what they're doing, and it's kind of A's, but if they don't end up with an A at the end, that can I get that even with, the old standard grading, because I do kind of a combination of what you've been talking about in some ways, in that I allow students to revise assignments. I have a little bit different system in that I set a final due date and time, and then any time up to that they can submit for feedback and revision, and I remind them that practically every day they're in there in a class and online regularly. But if it drops considerably, if it was like, either saying you're doing just fine progressing along at midterm and then they end up with a final grade of something like a C, they get very upset.
But they have the grades to see that. So that's why they have 2 grades from me prior to their self-assessment. So those are check-in points. So with my 101 students, for example, they pick which of their 3 traditional essays they submit to be traditionally graded. Essay 1 is a narrative. Usually that's just let's find my feet. So it's usually essay 2 or 3 that the students are submitting to be traditionally graded. And that they have the rubric the whole time. They can self-assess themselves. And then when they submit it and see, oh, okay, yes, I'm doing excellent. I received a 93, perfect, I'm on task. Or, oh, I only received a 70. I have lots of growth before I get to my research position paper. So, when they submit the research position paper, they have conferenced, they've done peer review, they've done all these steps along the way. they shouldn't be surprised. But again, I had that one student who submitted a 2-page paper. It wasn't even 5 paragraphs, didn't have citations. Like if you go through the rubric, you're going to see you're not going to
Right.
pass.
Yeah. Well, you can justify it at the end. It's more a matter of how they interact and respond along the way. And I've used the form, well, when they're putting them in early, I would say at this point in time, if it was your final grade on this particular assignment. And by the way, I do a huge amount of writing in my classes. I actually worked out with the English faculty that we match basically in my classes the number of words that are written in an English class. And so I do give them, this is what it would be now. It will change. Consider it a placeholder until you're done, okay, is what I actually tell them.
I think that's a good way to, because this is just where you are today. I think
Yeah,
that's a good way to approach it.
It's not real. It's just a placeholder if your brain needs that. So.
Well, thank you, everyone. It's 11:55. I think that's our end point. So we want to thank you for coming today. And if there's anything we can do to assist you, please reach out to us. We are not hard to find, and you can get us on the Whova app as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great rest of your day.